Okay, so throughout your entire life, you've probably only ever been exposed to two incredibly narrow, carefully curated worldviews on the legacy of Winston Churchill. You have the left on one side who, whilst of course they would never dare question his decision to enter into World War II against Germany, they decide to focus more on his actions, for example, in the Bengali famine, and to paint him as nothing much more than a white supremacist imperialist. And alternatively, on the right of the political spectrum, of course, they would never even dare to question or to attempt to defend in any way Churchill's supposedly racist attitudes of the time, so instead, to defend his legacy and to shine a more positive spotlight on it, they decide to depict him as a real based British patriot, a bastion of Western liberal democracies and values who got us through our darkest time, liberated us against the evil, disgusting fascist Nazis, and as we're told 1,000,000 times, or 6,000,000 times you could say, without Churchill, we'd all supposedly be speaking German today. And I want you to notice that although both groups diverge slightly on the issue, they're both arguing within the same narrow parameters or Overton window per se. They both promulgate the idea that Churchill was at least to some degree a hero for bringing us into World War II, whilst also admonishing his politically incorrect views on race and ethnicity and, in his view, white superiority. For example, his famous proposed slogan for the 1955 British general election being "Keep Britain White." But today, in light of the viral Bank of England's decision to replace the face of Winston Churchill on our £5 notes with that of a hedgehog, I'm going to focus and attempt to debunk as briefly as possible, in a nutshell, the claims made primarily on the right of the political spectrum that Churchill was supposedly some sort of based British nationalist wartime hero. And if you're someone on the right and wondering why I myself, who am also on the right, is so vehemently anti-Churchill, maybe the recent video and statement of Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who's incredibly progressive, pro-mass immigration, pro-gay, pro-trans rights, etc., recently came out, like I said, with a statement in favour of Winston Churchill and against, strongly against, the decision of the Bank of England to remove his face from our £5 notes, well, maybe that will arise from suspicions within your consciousness.
Now they're going to take Winston Churchill off our fivers. Can you believe it? I can't think of a worse time to do this. With a war waging in Europe, we should be celebrating Britain's defiance of the Nazis and commemorating the sacrifices of the greatest generation, not taking Churchill off our banknotes. And not just that, they want to get rid of Jane Austen, J.W. Turner and Alan Turing too. Great Britons, all to be replaced with animals. Now I love nature as much as anyone else, but for goodness sake, let's celebrate our wonderful British wildlife, sure. Winston Churchill helped save our country and the whole of Europe from fascism. He deserves better than being replaced by a badger.
Okay, so one of the first and perhaps the most infamous, disastrous military failings of Churchill was at the start of World War I in 1915, when he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was the primary advocate of the ruinous, failed attempted invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, in which almost 60,000 Allied troops perished. However, he did manage to regain at least some of his prestige by leading a battalion on the Western Front, and later he even served as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But alas, by the late 1930s, disaster struck again for Mr. Churchill, and he came into crippling debt because of bad stock market losses and his own lavish lifestyle. In fact, it got so bad that by 1938, he almost had to declare bankruptcy and had to put his own family house, the Chartwell, on the housing market. Now here's where it gets sinister. At the very peak of Churchill's almost complete and utter bankruptcy in March of 1938, he was suddenly given a total sum of £18,000, the equivalent of almost 2 million in today's currency, and his debt was wiped off the map completely. The man who gave him this incredibly generous gift was a Jewish Austrian incredibly wealthy banker by the name of Henry Strakosch, a man who was also incredibly financially involved in an anti-Nazi pro-intervention group called the Focus. Some other of the most influential key members of this elite networking anti-Nazi pro-intervention group include a Jewish socialist called Eugene Speyer, a critical Jewish financier to the group called Sir Robert Mond, and another key critical financial backer and organiser of the group at the time was a Jewish Zionist businessman by the name of Sir Robert Wadey Cohen. And a coincidence perhaps, but he was also a senior executive at Shell Transport and Trading Company, which later merged with another petroleum company to form Royal Dutch Shell, a company that Victor Rothschild, another major financial backer of the Focus and other such groups, would later work at. Okay, now let's get back to Churchill. So he takes an absolute fortune to pay off his debts from this warhawk Henry Strakosch. Then he spends the subsequent months shilling for a war or intervention with Germany until finally 7 months later in October 1938 he delivers one of his most famous speeches in the Houses of Parliament, condemning the Munich Agreement and advocating explicitly for war with Germany, saying, "If we do not go to war, then we will surely suffer defeat." Skip forward a bit until 8 months after the phony war against Germany with Chamberlain still at the head, and Britain launches Operation Wilfred, which was intended to get to Norway before the Germans in order to cut off their ore supply. Except only problem, Hitler and Germany got there first, and the operation was a complete failure. And despite Churchill being the main advocate for it, Chamberlain took the fall, was forced to resign, and Churchill became Prime Minister. He then completely committed Britain to fighting the most deadly war of the 20th century. 35 million European deaths. Britain was 250% of its GDP in debt. It was bankrupt, and this ultimately caused the death of not just her, but every single European empire, formally marking the end of hundreds of years of European excellence and world domination. And as if to add insult to injury, not only did Churchill help Stalin by distracting Hitler and preoccupying him in the West, he also directly gave him supplies through the Lend-Lease agreement. 13,000 tanks, 14,000 aircraft, over 4.5 million tons of food from Britain directly into Stalin's hands to defeat Hitler. And what did we tangibly get out of all this? Well, ironically, directly after World War II, the Soviet Union invaded Poland. And that was the entire reason we went to war, ostensibly, was to protect the sovereignty of Poland. And what did we actually achieve? We just transferred the ownership of Poland from a fascist state to a communist one. Great. Oh, and we got half a century of world superpower, communism, domination, and a Cold War. Great. Congratulations, Winston Churchill. Oh, and before I forget, the destruction of Berlin, Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Warsaw, London, Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth. And you want to know what the icing on the cake is? We got our first major wave of mass migration from the Caribbean called the Windrush generation directly after World War II in 1948. And what was the reason given to us to accept these migrants? Well, to rebuild after our cities were destroyed in World War II, meaning if we had never entered World War II, we would never have gotten our very first wave of mass migration. Okay, but you may be wondering, but Hitler started it all, right? He wanted to invade Poland and Czechoslovakia, he wanted a European empire, he wanted to invade all of Europe, and surely if we had not fought against him, we would all be speaking German, right? Wrong. The operation plan to invade France, Full Gleb, and the operation plan to invade Britain, or the hypothetical plan to invade Britain, called Operation Sea Lion, these were both made after Britain and France declared war on Germany. And even though, yes, Hitler did manage to successfully invade France after France first declared war on Germany, everyone knows, historians, Hitler himself, his generals, everyone knew that Operation Sea Lion was basically purely hypothetical. It would have been impossible for Germany to basically ever invade Britain. Why? Because of the English Channel and the Royal Navy. It would have been impossible. We could have stayed completely absent of World War II. We could never have intervened, and we would never have been invaded. We would never be speaking German. Finally, there's the fact that Hitler never even wanted a war with Britain. He loved the English people. He saw them as Germans' kin. All he wanted was Lebensraum, living space, in the East. He wanted to invade the Soviet Union, and we should have just let him. We should have let him destroy communism. We would never have had a Cold War. We would never have had Soviet world domination for half a century. And what would we have got instead? We would have just had a German empire in East Europe. I think we could live with that, honestly. From Hitler's first book, Mein Kampf, he wrote, quote, "No sacrifice would have been too great to win England's alliance. Germany must renounce colonies and naval rivalry if that would secure England's friendship. For Germany, there are two possible allies in Europe, England and Italy." In 1935, Hitler even signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which limited Hitler's navy size to only 35% of that of the Royal Navy, and he did this deliberately as a step forward for cooperation with Britain, who he really wanted an alliance with. So to recap, not only was Churchill completely and utterly bought and paid for by foreign interest groups, but also he got us into a war that served us nothing other than to annihilate tens of millions of our own men and women, that destroyed the entirety of Europe, all of our empires, left us in crippling debt, and all for what? To allow the direct ascension of the largest communist dictatorship in history, and led us into a Cold War that lasted half a century, and we didn't even get Poland. We didn't even get Poland, and we got mass immigration. So if you're happy with all that, then I guess feel free to defend the legacy of Winston Churchill, but I will not do so. But anyway, that's all I've got. Thank you very much for watching. Please go subscribe right here on YouTube. Go follow my Rumble. All links in description. X at Jack Passy. Like I said, all links in description. I really appreciate the support. Thank you very much, and au revoir.